Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome back to the BSHS Digital History Festival 2023. We're here with our third day, and our first panel of this day today is entitled Science, Environment, Engagement in South Asia and Beyond. And we have four brilliant panelists that are just making their way in. And so with no further ado, I'll hand over to our chair, Amelia. Amelia, take it away.
Thank you very much, Sam, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining our roundtable at this rather early hour of the day, at least in the UK. As you've heard, I'm Amelia Bonea. I'm a lecturer in global history of science, technology, and medicine at the University of Manchester, and I'm joined by three panelists, so I'm sure we'll bring a host of exciting interdisciplinary insights to this debate. So we have Vaishali Shroff, who is an award-winning author and scriptwriter from Mumbai. She has a degree in electronics and telecommunications and has worked in this field for nearly a decade. But for the past 14 years, she has also been writing children's books on a range of subjects, including paleontology in India. And her work in this field has been featured in BBC Future and ABC Australia. Then we have Kartik Shanker, who is a professor at the Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, who works on the ecology, behavior, and evolution of terrestrial and marine fauna, especially sea turtles in India, so you're allowed to be very envious. He is a founding trustee of Dakshin Foundation, founding editor of the magazine Current Conservation, and authors of several books of fiction and non-fiction, including one on the history of sea turtle conservation in India. And last but not least, we have Graeme Gooday, professor of history of science and technology at the University of Leeds. He has authored several important books on the history of technology, is co-investigator on the Congruence Engine project, which seeks to connect industrial history collections in the UK, and principal investigator on the Arts and Humanities Research Council Impact and Engagement Project, Electrifying Women. Graeme is also a dedicated teacher who has won several prizes for educational work. I wanted to say a quick word about why we decided to convene this roundtable. As you could probably tell from the abstract, we have all engaged with sciences and histories of the environment in South Asia from different disciplinary and in some cases trans-regional angles. And we all share a concern with translating our work across different media and registers of presentation and making knowledge about the environment and the history of science more generally available to wider audiences, be it via the medium of children's books, documentary theater in my case, film, or public outreach project. So we thought it might be a good idea to use this forum to reflect on our experiences. And more specifically, we wanted to bring examples from our work to address several interrelated questions. How can we promote collaboration between historians of science, scientists, writers, artists, science communicators with an interest in natural heritage, the environment, and the history of environmental sciences broadly construed in South Asia and beyond? What lessons have we learned from our work so far? And why indeed is it important to conduct this kind of work? Each of us will have about 7 minutes to introduce our work, and afterwards we will open the floor for discussion. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box as we go, and we will pick them up at the end of our talks. I'm going to use my privilege as a chair to begin. So let me just share my screen. Yeah, I hope you can all see it. Yeah, so I'm a historian of science, technology, and media in South Asia with a rather unusual secondary research interest in the history of scientific interactions between India and Japan, where I completed most of my studies. And after publishing my first academic monograph on telegraphy and journalism in colonial India, I decided to translate its subject matter into a story for children. This was published open access in 2018 with Pratham Books Storyweaver, one of India's biggest non-profit publishers. And it has since been translated into several Indian and non-Indian languages, including Kora, an endangered language spoken in parts of India and Bangladesh. And this was an eye-opening moment for me. A story that began its journey as an academic history book acquired a life of its own by being translated, unbeknown to me, by a group of volunteers who want to promote literacy in endangered languages. And I had always been fascinated by the way scientific knowledge has circulated historically across different media of communications. So I decided to take the story on its next journey, teaming up with artists and high school students in Hyderabad to create a documentary theater performance. Now, I should say that I had no idea what documentary theater was when I embarked on this new project. I simply passed on the story and some of my archival materials to the students and the artists, Shanker, who conceptualized and implemented this project. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see what they came up with in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic when we couldn't leave our houses. A multilingual performance about technology and distance that features annotated maps of British imperial communications, old technologies found at home, and Farsi rap. Strangely enough, my first monograph also led to a new research project on the history of paleontology in South Asia, which was funded by the German Research Foundation. And by this time, I think I had enough experience to realize that this was a topic with huge potential for cross-disciplinary collaboration. Not knowing much about fossils myself, I teamed up with 2 paleontologists and several museum curators to study collections of South Asian fossils in the UK, Germany, the US, and Japan. And I also used this opportunity to create an archive of interviews with scientists, illustrators, science communicators, and journalists who had been working on the topic of the environment in South Asia. This is still work in progress. Now, one of the fascinating things about this new project was trying to understand how fossil plants and animals, which had been excavated in the Indian subcontinent, underwent what I like to call a process of de- and recontextualization, as they were removed from their original abodes and incorporated into institutions of education, research, and public edification like museums elsewhere, usually abroad. And it struck me that this process of de- and recontextualization was not unlike my own public engagement work, which always involved certain choices about the kind of information I presented, how I presented it, and to whom. And this kind of engagement that transcends the confines of one's disciplinary community has become an opportunity for learning for all involved. At least this is what happened in my case, because I often use the feedback I receive to think about how I could write different histories of science. For example, histories that address the role of women in earth and environmental sciences, or try to challenge T-Rex's dominance in the public imagination by discussing dinosaurs excavated in India and Tanzania, or bring to light the sheer amount of indigenous labor and knowledge that those excavations involved. And you have here an image on the left of what it actually meant to excavate some of these fossils. So I would like to end by introducing my archive bin, an idea I adapted from Sam Weinberg's book, Why Learn History When It's Already on Your Phone. And 2 weeks ago, I took this bin to primary school children in Manchester to discuss how historians write stories about science. And we established that in order to write those stories, we first need to find clues. And luckily, my bin was full of such clues. Plesiosaurus, representing Mary Anning's discovery. Brachiosaurus, representing the giraffe titan excavated in Germany, East Africa, now Tanzania, more than a century ago, currently on display at the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. And a Barapasaurus, representing the Barapasaurus tagore, excavated in India in the 1960s and named after Rabindranath Tagore. And the bin also contains, as you can probably see, stickers, dinosaur stickers, attached to some of my historical records, which the children had to find and use to write or draw, usually, their own stories about the history of science. There was also a magnifying glass, my Japanese calligraphy brush, repurposed to dust clues, and a lantern in case it got too dark to find them. So what I learned from this exercise is that first, one can never have enough dinosaurs in an archive bin because 6-7-year-olds are still learning to share. They are, however, incredibly perceptive and understand what historical evidence is. So this became clear when a little girl asked me how I knew that Mary Anning and not someone else had discovered the plesiosaurus. And finally, children love to learn about topics they can identify with. One of the boys wanted to take home this old picture of the Brachiosaurus on display at the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. And I suspect that this was the first time he learned that dinosaurs came from Africa as well. So I'm going to stop this and I'll pass on to Vaishali, who is going to talk again about dinosaurs and fossil bones in an Indian context.
Okay, I'm going to share. Okay. Okay, so thank you, Amelia. That was a really insightful talk. And hello, everyone who's tuned in.
Vaishali, we can see your script, so you have to, yeah. We
can. Oh, you can't see my screen?
Yes, now it's good. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Can you see it now?
Yeah. What you'll need to do is just stop the share. Sam, you'll need to stop the share and then do the share again, but just select the PowerPoint window.
Okay, all right, sorry. Okay. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Can you see it now? All right. Sorry about that. Okay. All right. Yes. So I'm no scientist or scholar. I'm a children's author, passionate about writing stories that give agency to unexplored places, untold histories, unsung people, and voiceless non-humans. I've published over 250 stories, fiction and nonfiction. My works related to science and environment include The Adventures of Padma and a Blue Dinosaur by HarperCollins India about the history of paleontology in India, Tatung Tatung and Other Amazing Stories of India's Diverse Languages by Penguin India on linguistic anthropology and India's dying linguistic diversity. Sita's Chitwan, Not Just a Walk in Nepal's First National Park, again Penguin India, about wildlife conservation in Nepal and beyond. There's a Leopard in My House by DLB on urban deforestation and animal families for Oxford, UK. My ongoing projects include a book on unsung Indian scientists who revolutionized neglected sciences, such as herpetology, archaeology, life sciences, earth sciences, and another one on riverine science with a focus on displaced populations and revival of dead rivers in India and South Asia. This diversity of subjects is intentional. While scholars study and discuss these subjects in academic circles, there's no awareness among the common people about these things. Books are powerful. They contribute towards a rich archive of undocumented stories. And the fact remains that these stories need to be told and someone needs to do it. Writing these books has given me the opportunity to learn from historians and scholars and collaborate with them from diverse fields and understand the ground realities. Today, I'll focus on The Adventures of Padma and a Blue Dinosaur. Okay. Which puts the spotlight on paleontology in India. In 2016, I stumbled upon the natural fossil site at Balasinor, Gujarat, a state in Western India, while on a road trip. I almost thought it was a joke. A natural dinosaur fossil site and hatchery in India were unheard of. Upon reaching there, I realized the wealth of knowledge we had been deprived of until then. I saw fossils embedded in rocks for as far as my eyes could see. And I imagined that flatland come alive with dinosaurs and visions of a Jurassic Park, or more accurately, a Cretaceous Park existing millions of years ago, right where I was standing, just blew my mind. At the same time, it made me angry. How come we had no clue about this national treasure? We needed to know this, and I think our children need to know this. And thus began my journey with this book. British naturalist W.H. Sleeman discovered the first dinosaur fossil in Jabalpur, central India in 1828, and that was a titanosaur. That fossil, along with many others that were subsequently discovered in India, was sent off to England. So while England, Europe, and then the US enjoyed our fossils, generations of people in India were deprived of knowing anything about them. When Harper asked me to write this book, the last thing I wanted to do was create a catalog of hard-to-remember, unfamiliar names like Bruhadkaiosaurus metlei or Barapasaurus tagore, when children were so used to the popular T-Rex or Spinosaurus. Instead, I wrote a story about a time-traveling adventure along India's Narmada River, where most of the dinosaur fossils have been discovered. Research for this book wasn't easy either, because paleontology is a highly undocumented subject in India. I wrote to paleontologists, and I received no response from some. Some even asked me what's in it for me. I literally had nothing to write when one morning I received a hello in my inbox. It was Professor Suresh Srivastava, the man behind the Rajasaurus narmadensis. He introduced me to Professor Ashok Sani, and that was a turning point for me, actually. Professor Sani shared scientific papers, books, anecdotes, everything he possibly could with me. We had really long conversations about the history of paleontology in India and everything connected to the discoveries. So the first half of my book is Padma's adventure, and the other half takes the reader through the evolution and extinction of dinosaurs, introduces them to species they've never heard of, and encourages them to look at paleontology as a potential career option. I've traveled across India with this book and even shared it with children across the globe during the pandemic. So that's me and my children at Rayoli in Balasanor in Gujarat at the fossil site. And that's my son looking at the fossil. That's me taking the book to schools and literature festivals across India. And so I not only introduce children to our very own desi dinosaurs, as they say, but I show them fossils and tools. I get them excited about excavation and tell them that we need more paleontologists because many species still lay buried. This book has been a catalyst for spreading awareness about our fossil heritage. I want to be a paleontologist, so thanks to you, we now know about our own dinosaurs. This book started making an impact. The number of people visiting the fossil site after reading the book multiplied too. But how do I tell these children that they may not get a job, they may not receive any funding for their excavations, or that there is no guarantee their fossils will be protected? Paleontologist Dr. Harsha Dhiman says that while there is no gender bias in this field in India, and there are adequate research facilities, which is good news, lack of funding, lack of jobs, and no awareness on the significance of fossils are the biggest roadblocks to their research. That's where stories like Padma's come to the rescue. Professor Sani adds, paleontology is not mainstream in India anymore. Only the very motivated opt for it. And I hope for the sake of this motivated group and for a deeper understanding of evolution, extinction, and climate change, that we get better support for taking earth sciences forward in India. In 2019, I wrote the first ever short film on Indian dinosaurs. Rajasaur, about a girl who saves a dinosaur egg from the clutches of a snake. Now, my work doesn't stop here. My book, Tatung Tatung, puts the spotlight on endangered languages and identities and is a call for action to protect our indigenous knowledge and mother languages before it's too late, because one language dies somewhere in this world every 14 days. So I take my role and responsibility as an author and science communicator seriously, and I hope I get opportunities to take more such untold stories to as many people as I possibly can. Thank you so much, BSHS, for this opportunity to share these important stories from India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vaishali. That was fascinating. Next up is Kartik, but before that, could I just please remind the audience that if they click on the resources box at the bottom of the screen, we have a link to Vaishali's book trailer and also film trailer, and I think also a link to my documentary theater performance, which I introduced in my talk. Kartik, your floor is yours.
Thank you, Amelia. Let me just try and bring this up. Oops. All right, can you see the presentation? Great. Thanks to begin with, thanks to BSHS and Amelia for inviting me and this great panel putting this together. I'm going to sort of meander a little bit through my journey as a scientist that has accidentally led to both writing and history, and perhaps try and make some links between the range of things that one does and what one's able to do with it in our engagement with society. In science, increasingly over the last few decades, there's been a drive towards specialization. One kind of physicist can't understand another. Ecologists highly specialized, molecular biologists even more so. And so this is really a story of swimming, if you will, against that tide. My story starts with sea turtles. I started working on olive ridleys in a large town on a small nesting beach on the east coast of India as an undergraduate. That led 10 years later to my work on the mass nesting beaches in Orissa. That's what the beach looks like when there are 50,000 turtles there nesting on a single night. And you can understand why I became fascinated with that. I moved to tracking leatherback turtles. We tracked them all over the Indian Ocean, and this was what went on in my professional life. But on the side, someone suggested to me that I should do a children's story about this because turtles live such interesting lives. And I think the part that really got me hooked was they found me this fabulous illustrator, Maya Ramaswamy, and she produced this book that was really pretty and really inspiring, and had all of these lovely images that I wrote around. And in a way, my addiction to children's writing began with the production of these beautiful illustrations, which I myself was completely incapable of doing. So it was pretty much like, oh, I just have to write a few words and somebody produces something that makes it really pretty. But a few years later, when I was looking at my impact, I think my most cited paper has been cited a few hundred times. My children's books have sold tens of thousands of copies. And, so one has to ask oneself which audience one is really successfully reaching. But I also was drawn into a book on the history of sea turtle conservation, which starts with my mentor, who in the 70s was a failed engineer, but met some like-minded people and became the first turtle man of India, passed away a few months ago. But wanting to write about, essentially actually wanting to write about him led me to a book that was really about the history of sea turtle conservation in India, that then traced the journeys of the many people that had contributed to this field, and was really a journey of learning for me as well, and for someone who was really bad at history in school. I thought it was ironic that my first authored book was a book on history. But I moved on from turtles. I moved on to an interest in various terrestrial taxa, including frogs, and those are just different species. And this is the professional part of what I do. My student worked on the evolutionary history. These are trees that show relationships and their relationships to habitats and so on. But these bush frogs I've been fascinated with since my graduate days, and this ended up being the adventure of a frog called Tavalai, which is frog in Tamil, and how he sort of like wanders around, meeting all these animals I used to meet when I did my field work there, and in search of what he has been told is this big giant sea, which he really wants to discover. And so much of this came from incidental natural history observations while I was actually studying something else. That was intriguing to me as in terms of what I was actually studying professionally and what seemed, what I was passionate about communicating. The third and last story is about another range of research that I do on flocks of birds that forage together, which comprise different species. And entirely incidentally, when we were working in the Nicobar Islands on leatherback turtles, we saw this really interesting associations between drongos and tree shrews and sparrowhawks, and we were really surprised that sparrowhawks were not trying to feed on the tree shrews, but with them. And this translated sort of quite obliquely into a story about a slender loris, and the association stayed in my mind, but the story was set in the Western Ghats. So the tree shrew became a loris, and that's the slender loris. It's centered around her association with a racket-tailed drongo, their shared love of insects, and an owl. So it wasn't the same species that I had been studied before, but this transformed into a new narrative through which we were able to tell a story about. I was able to tell a story about an adventure in the Ghats that again was spectacularly illustrated this time by Prabha Amelia. So to sort of sum that up, I think the range of experiences or different experiences that this is my meandering journey through ecology has sort of enabled this perspective that allows me to write and communicate both in terms of of ecology, but as well as in terms of the history of those fields. And to me, those intersecting interests are really valuable. And I don't think we're training young people in our institutions to have those sorts of intersecting interests, to explore interdisciplinarity. And I honestly believe we need to be doing more of that. And I hope that, some of the work that we do, including through the magazine that we produce, but the work that my fellow panelists do can really serve as as a platform and as an inspiration for that generation to pursue that intersectionality. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kartik. And next one is Graeme.
Thank you very much indeed, Amelia, for introducing me. And I hope you can now see the slides I put up. It's great, by the way, to hear such fascinating presentations on Indian biohistory. So let me explain. This project comes out of work with Emily Rees, who's in the audience today, hopefully joining us, looking at the world of women's work in engineering, working with organizations such as Women's Engineering Society, which had a centenary in Britain in 2019, and the archives of the Institution of Engineering and Technology. That collaborative model has been very productive. What it produced, though, is a very strong sense of a story to be told in other parts of the world, and particularly Africa and India. And we discovered some very interesting women indeed in this project. One of them you can see there on the top of the screen, Mrs. Lalita, India's first female engineer. And she appeared in 1964 as the only Indian woman at the International Conference of Women Engineers and Scientists. And looking into the history of these conferences, it turns out there's an amazing vista of potentially global participation of women in engineering and science, but with some fascinating constraints and agendas. So what we've done is to develop both a sense of the importance of looking at those conferences for what they can tell us about women in India and Africa especially, but also working with the organization that now runs these conferences. This is the International Network of Women Engineers and Scientists, and we've had some very productive conversations with Professor Jung-Sun Kim from South Korea, who's the president of INWES. And for that organization, we are now producing an oral history toolkit to make sure more of their stories are produced. So let me then move on to the next slide. It's not, this may take a while. Okay, my slides are stuck.
Just click on the window again, click on the slides and see if that.
Okay, there we go. Good. Thank you, Sam. So just to give you an example, that when we are looking at the project on international conferences, and the papers for these are available in various locations. For example, the Institution of Engineering and Technology Archives in London, also the Society of Women Engineers archives at Wayne State University in Detroit. I think some links from that hopefully will appear soon. And the themes are very much about women's work focused on infrastructure for human well-being and environmental management, hence the link to this session. And this conference has actually met twice in India, Mumbai in 1981 and New Delhi in 2017. I haven't looked at these in much detail yet, but it's interesting that the sponsors of the first of those was not only the Institution of Engineers in India, founded in 1920, but also the Indian Women's Scientists Association, formed in 1973. And you get a feeling for the infrastructural and natural environmental concerns by some session titles we've got there. For example, nutrition and health and disease, food, a big topic, pollution, population problems, expanding frontiers of agriculture, dairy and sea farming. But what we found in looking at these conferences is not only are these big themes, but glimpses of women's lives, which are very much not documented. So what we've been doing, as I mentioned just now, is to produce a mechanism for the stories of these women working to actually have their lives recorded by interviews, developing with some students at the University of Leeds who are participating in this project for credit in their degrees. And the idea being this toolkit will enable members of INWES to record their own stories, particularly for ICWES 19 that will take place in New Zealand in September. This toolkit is still in development, but you can see there the kind of things that we've been working on to make sure there's full advice to anyone in INWES, and indeed anyone, anywhere if they want to write their own history and share it. Point being partly that for many cultures it emerges that there's a real gender boundary or barrier to actually sharing one's own life story unless it's part of a wider conversation. Now, to give an idea of what we found in looking at ICWES, and this links to many other stories, sadly, Letitia Obeng died early this year. I so wish to have been able to talk to her. She is an example of a Ghanaian scientist. She's often called the grandmother of science in Ghana. And interestingly, there were no African delegates at the first international conference in 1964. They came to Britain in 1967. And interestingly, many of the African women there were those linked to former British colonial nations. Ghana had a very active scientific culture and was able to send Letitia Obeng to study in the UK. She studied basically tropical medicine and parasitology and ended up being the head of Ghana's Institute of Aquatic Biology. But what's really fascinating is her work shifts quite substantially very early in her career to become about fish stocks and dams and reservoirs. Ghana wanted to be self-sufficient in fish, and its gigantic Lake Volta and the linked Akosombo Dam used for hydroelectric power became the subject for her study in 1967, man-made lakes as a source of freshwater fish production in Africa, part of a classic ICWES discussion of the application of technology to food production. But interestingly, you look at her career profile, very much her expertise in parasitology is turned completely around to look at the interest of national food supply. Now, this keeps happening again and again in the stories we look at. And just to see how dedicated she was to studying this Volta basin, the Volta River was dammed to make a lake. You can see there how much she wrote about it and how much it became part of a publication culture in a second part of her career. Then just briefly, the student oral history is an ongoing program. So while it would have been wonderful to be able to interview Letitia Obeng, sadly we can't do that now, but we have had 2 years now of interviews, the students being trained by me and others to interview. And we've got several interesting stories, which you can see actually online already. INWES has actually promoted these oral histories by our students on their own website. And the students produced this image for their own front page using an image from ICWES in Turin in 1971. And 3 people we interviewed, I think I only have to talk about 2 of them. One was Seema Singh, a very senior figure in INWES, a professor of economics at Delhi Technical University, who's done a huge amount of work studying women in many kinds of engineering, both environmental, chemical and electrical. And talking to her, many others in India, it emerges how much engineering was very much an open profession for women for a long time, but almost always directed to desk work or the confines of the engineering workshop. Very little encouragement, indeed often banning of them from going out to work with male workforces in the field. So an exclusion, as it were, from working with the natural environment. By contrast, as we found for a number of African societies, Mary Mwangi from Kenya, a lecturer on biotechnology, talks very much in the interview about how she was nurtured in interest in biology by both of her parents, particularly her father, and became interested in banana tissue culture technology as a way of making the most sustainable and the most productive banana strains actually for production in India. So 9 more interviews are on their way, so we can come back to that another time. But just to finish off, let me say that all of this has raised some big comparative questions for us, thinking about the bigger issues, hopefully not too big. I mean, obviously, we've looked at INWES, which is perhaps you might say a rather elite organization, not necessarily typical of the kinds of work that women have done in STEM around the world. But we wanted to ask the question, well, first of all, what kind of culturally specific factors have shaped STEM women's opportunities and prerogatives for engaging with natural environment and sciences? It seems, looking at African nations and India, there are some distinctive differences. And what we find particularly linking to the second question is there are gender issues linking to the more traditional concern that women have often been attributed in terms of food supply and well-being. It looks as if still so often now the women that work in this world are actually pushed towards those areas of working with the environment for food and humans, less so for looking at animals for their own sake. Anyway, those are the questions which may not be interesting to discuss. There are the contacts that Emily and I have. Please do feel free to get in touch if you have any questions, and I shall end my presentation now.
Thank you very much, Graeme, for broadening our understanding of the environment and bringing up questions of disease, food, the construction of dams, which are very relevant, I think, to this discussion. I think we're going to open the floor to discussion and questions from the audience. We have about 15 minutes left, optimistically speaking. May I remind you that you can type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also still use the resources book to check out the links we have shared. I'm afraid you can't speak your questions because that option has been disabled, but if you would like to ask anything, then please do by typing in your questions, and I'm going to read them out to the panelists. I can't see anything yet, so while waiting for the audience to type in lots of questions, hopefully, I just wanted to pick up on the fact that one thing that really struck me as I was listening to your talk is the importance of images and of teaming up with good illustrators who are able to translate well, in my case, a very academic message into another register of presentation that appeals to a wider audience. And it made me think that people have different ways of learning. Some people learn better by reading, others by listening. So I think that's why it's very important to team up with people from different disciplinary and professional backgrounds. And the other thing that struck me is especially listening to Graeme's talk, is the importance of network in our own professional lives, but also when it came to the women scientists who struggled so much in an environment that was often, more often than not, male dominated. And it was often this kind of personal connections that helped them to survive and to strive. I don't know if you have anything to add on any of this topics. If you do, please feel free to unmute yourself. Yes, Kartik.
Yeah, I mean, while we're waiting, I think that there's two elements to working with illustrators. One, of course, is that, as you said, it's a different way of reaching an audience and sort of drawing them in. But I think there's also the element of how the scientist or the writer is transformed by the nature of the illustration itself. And when we work at Current Conservation, we sometimes get the author and the illustrator to work together. And I think it changes the way that we try to communicate an idea when we try and visualize an illustration that might go with it, or see a sketch and so on. So I think I started out with this as a one-way street. I gave my writing to an illustrator, they produced something. But over time, Laurie's Magical Mystery, which was the last children's book that I wrote, I actually wrote the book when I saw the illustrations that Prabha had done for a different book. And she showed me sketches, and the mood of the book came from the tone of her illustrations. And I knew it succeeded because a young reader actually compared the two books without knowing that they had the same illustrator, you know. She said, oh, the writing was so much like that. And I said, but I've never actually read that other book. I just, you know, and so the fact that that an illustration could evoke the same kind of writing from two authors that had never met each other. I think we sometimes don't, at least me, see, as a scientist, I have not given enough credit to the power of this other medium of messaging. And I think co-discovering each other's strengths is an important part of communicating and building our networks in a sense, right?
Yeah, that's a very interesting. That's a very interesting point. Vaishali, did you want to add? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'd like to add to what Kartik is saying, that in India, in traditional publishing houses, the author and illustrator don't work together. And so I had done a few books before I did my dinosaur book. But when it came to doing the illustrations, which, by the way, are done by Suveda Mistry, they're just fabulous. She was the first illustrator who I worked with after submitting my manuscript, and we worked for almost an entire year because these dinosaurs were never shown either in print or in any other media. So to get them technically correct in terms of illustrations, we worked together. And that was very interesting for me. And another one was when I was working on Rajasaur, the movie. I actually worked with a VFX artist to get the Rajasaurus, in perfect dimensions and features and the bump and everything. So that was another very interesting experience for me because we wanted the Rajasaurus to, be as accurate as possible, even in animated form. So I think I really enjoyed those experiences. But yes, illustrators are very important when it comes to books on science because they both go hand in hand, the text and the diagrams or the figures and illustrations.
May I just ask a follow-up question? How did the collaboration with scientists unfold? Because you are mentioning exactly this part. Trying to get the reconstruction right, and so working with illustrators is one thing, and then how about working with scientists in this field? How did that unfold?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, please, if you could just add. Yes.
Yeah. So for me, I was working very closely with Professor Sani, and I would discuss the features of the dinosaur, and first I would make my own notes as to how the teeth should be and how the scales should be, and they don't have big tails, and they are a belosaurid, so they don't have long arms. So I made my notes and I shared it with the VFX guy, and then I would run them by Professor Sani, and then he would give me add further to my notes and say that this is how no two teeth of the Rajasaur are the same, he would say, and they keep growing. So the teeth were very fascinating for me. So we actually focused a lot on the teeth when we were designing the Rajasaurus and even the scales. And one of the reasons, so when I was doing the book, it's a blue dinosaur. I've given dinosaurs all sorts of colors because, the skin never gets fossilized, and what if they were colorful? We gave them all sorts of browns and, dirty greens, and what if they were vibrant, and I think about our tawny striped tigers, may God forbid, years down the line, if somebody were to excavate fossils of a tiger, what color would they give it? Would they give it the stripes? No, they wouldn't even call it a tiger. So I'm just saying, I try to imagine another side of dinosaurs, which is not generally projected in our movies or in the Jurassic Park franchise, that they may be colorful, they may be, vibrant looking, and but obviously for the movie we couldn't, because I don't think the audience would have accepted orange and purple dinosaurs. But yeah, it was very interesting working with the artists and the scientists and trying to, bring everyone on the same page. Yeah. We are working on a movie right now, a full-length feature film, where we are showing many more Indian species. So I hope that works out well.
Very much looking forward to that. Graeme, do you have any thoughts on the collaboration between historians of science and scientists? I think you need to unmute yourself. Graeme, I think you need to unmute. Yes, no.
Sorry, yes, I've not said anything useful yet. My only thought was that actually history of science has had an interesting symbiosis over the years with scientists, and it's gone through phases of close collaboration and then teenage bad-tempered rejection, then back again to sort of middle-aged collaboration. It does seem that a lot of the time scientists actually have wondered what historians of science do. It's a relief to find that many scientists now realize that we are actually mostly their friends, and there's a whole load of materials that we can share with them. I think part of the problem, has been that historians of science haven't always been able to communicate well to scientists who are busy people. But I'm really reassured by hearing from Kartik and Vaishali that it's very straightforward. If you've got a clear message and an important thing to say using historical sources, the scientists will actually be there to listen and share projects. It's a natural thing to do. After all, historians of science best not actually, I think, biting the hand that feeds it with so many interesting stories of what scientists actually do. But there is also the point that illustrations are the crucial thing, as you've just heard. So much can be won by just having the most effective ways of communicating visually what you're doing. Long articles and textbooks in history of science do not reach out to many people. I'm not sure how many people even read anything more than a few thousand words now. So I think illustrators are definitely the answer. And I would love to learn more from you, actually, Vaishali, about how yours got so well colored. I need to do more than just black and white in my work, certainly.
I can certainly identify with that, but also picking up on what Kartik said, that he was not good at history in school. I happen to be good at history and math, so I liked both subjects, and I think I'm doing the perfect job now, combining both. And trying to spread the word to younger students as well about how important it is, to have a background both in science and the humanities. But I do agree that I think we are very much, as historians of science, we are very much still very much biased towards the printed word. And I could see this when I actually started working on this project on the history of paleontology, and went into a different sort of archives, walked into a different sort of archives that was, the materiality of it was very different, and including, the vertical arrangement of the collection itself, which was very different from the horizontal one that you usually get with, books that are lined up on a shelf. And that made me think that as historians of science, we should definitely engage more with this material aspect of science making and with the practices of science making. And the sheer amount of manual labor that was involved in actually excavating these fossils and carrying them from one place to another and studying them. I think we might have yes, we have a question from Manisha Shah. Are the publishers encouraging authors to reach out to scientists and write books for the young readers? Who would like to answer that?
Vaishali.
Yeah, can you repeat the question again? Can you repeat the question again? I'll take it.
Are the publishers encouraging authors to reach out to scientists and write books for the young readers?
Yes and no. Yes, because it's important. Without them, how do we write the books? Because not all sciences are documented in a way that you want to distill it for children to understand. So I'm talking from a point of view of children's literature. And no, because most publishers do not have funding for research. And there are a lot of research circles where I have approached where they do expect to be compensated for research material, and as Kartik or anybody would know, there's not much money to be made in writing these books and, selling these books. So while they do, and they want you to, get in touch with scientists and write books, they leave it to the author's discretion because there's no money to be offered. So, if somebody generously, like Professor Sani or Professor Srivastav, generously offered, all their knowledge and resources that they had to write the book. But not everybody is like them, if I want to put it that way. So yeah, it's, you gain from some associations and then you just leave the others. But yeah, coming back to keep it short, yes, they do want you to reach out to scientists. They do want you to collaborate, because you want, at the end of the day, I'm not an expert in any of these subjects, so I want somebody to validate the information that's going out, because I want it to be accurate. I don't want to wing any information that I'm putting in the books. So so I ensure that from my side that I have a subject matter expert, a scientist, a historian, whoever is required to write my subject. I ensure that I have those contacts in place before I start writing.
Okay, we're running out of time. There's one more question now. How to create a positive feedback loop to encourage more of this sort of collaboration, especially for those who asked Vaishali for money. If money is not available, how to encourage? Kartik, I think you wanted to say something before as well. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? I had to turn my headphones off. Yeah, I would say pretty products. It's like candy. We gotta hand stuff out that looks good for them. I mean, it's so I try and so when I'm really sorry to hear that scientists wanted to be compensated for giving time or material. I'm really sorry to hear that. As a fellow scientist, I was not aware. I'm not surprised, but I want to emphasize the point that Vaishali made about money. So in the two books that I worked on, including the current one on paleontology, I'm spending what would be the equivalent of $5,000 or so, which is all coming out of my own discretionary research grants. If you're a writer, where does that money come from? I'm spending it because I'm a scientist and I've got a pot that I can dip into. And I would not be able to write those books if I did not do the traveling and the talking and and the meeting people and and a whole bunch of other sort of associated costs. So there are those challenges are not going to go away. But the question that was asked on the Q&A, I think. For me, it's like, you've got to hand the toffees out. So, so the book that I'm doing, I've talked to a lot of paleontologists, but I plan to have little portraits of some of them, or, promote them in some way that makes them feel good about the fact that this book came out. Because I think the question is correct. How do you incentivize scientists giving, people like Professor Ashok Sani, they're gems, but obviously not everyone is a Professor Sani, and so how do we it's an interesting question, and I'd like for all of us to think about what those incentives might be. For me, it's always pretty products that they're part of in some form or the other, giving them some of the spotlight as well in some way, and I think that maybe is that's what academics live for, right? So, if I might say so. Yeah.
I don't know, Sam, if we have time for another question, or should we wrap it up now? Because I think we're 5 minutes over.
Go on.
Okay, so there's one question. How does somebody go about pitching a book for younger audiences? And this is the last question we will discuss. If anyone has any ideas. Yes, Vaishali, please go ahead.
If you have a children's book idea, or you have written something for children and you really truly believe that that story needs to be shared, I'd advise that you first look at wherever you are. So if you're in India, you look up children's publishers and go through their book lists and see what kind of books they publish, because what book works for one publisher may not work for another, because they just don't publish those kind of books. There are some publishers who do picture books. There are some publishers who don't do picture books at all. So look at your format, look at your content, and see if you have matches out there, and then send out your proposal go through their submission guidelines and start there. I would say, that's a good place to start.
Amelia, can I add to that?
Briefly, please. Yes.
Don't expect. I said don't expect to make money out of it. None of us does. But it's always exciting to get a big publisher like Penguin. But Amelia, you mentioned Pratham and Storyweaver.
Yes.
Storyweaver, great platform on which you can publish your books, and people can freely translate it. And Turtle Story, which I showed pictures of, has been translated into 20 languages internationally, including Romanian and Igbo. And I was like, wow, it's such. I never knew that my stories would be translated into these languages, and it's through this free Creative Commons platform. So I think that there's other ways than the traditional publishing route as well that can at least be a starting point for reaching out to.
In fact, there are a lot of, if I may add to that, there are a lot of independent publishing houses out there. One of my recent books called Batata Pau and All Things Portuguese is about the Portuguese history of India. And it's published by the People Place Project. And that's a research initiative based in Mumbai. I did not pitch anyone this book to any other publishing house, even though I published with Harper or Penguin. I did not, because the person who heads this research initiative knows people and places and how they connect so well. And I didn't think there would be a better person to, do this book with than anyone else, because seldom you get inputs. Editor comes in at a very later stage, when you're writing big works, and to have someone to give you more insights into the history and she knows exactly what you're writing is very rare. So I collaborated with them. So like I said, see your content and see who works best for you, because it's not just of course, it's about the best contract that you get, but it's also about what kind of support you get in terms of, research and editing and everything else till your book goes to press and even after. So yeah, a lot of points to consider, but it's a learning process. I've got here after many, many years of struggling in this industry, but it all pays off.
I think this is thank you, Vaishali. I think this is a very optimistic point to wrap up on. And in fact, if I may add, the very fact that we were able to have this wonderful conversation here today, I think it's a sign that this kind of collaborations can happen and they can work very well. And please stay tuned, because we are preparing more and from now on. And if you enjoyed this event, this conversation and this event, I think I'm supposed to encourage you now to join the British Society for the History of Science. You can find more information on the festival website or on the homepage of the British Society for the History of Science. Otherwise, thank you very much to the panelists for joining this discussion, and also the audience for the wonderful questions, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye.